Okay, everybody, today we are reading chapter 8 called Moses is a Woman. Seeing a girl seated in a rocking chair with her sewing in her lap, the men stopped in the doorway. The young man Laura had noticed outside her window, the one the sheriff had called Walt, was the first to recover. "Well, look who's here," he exclaimed, swaggering across the threshold. "It's young Miss Eastman herself, and just as pretty as I heard she was." Laura's anger rose to the boiling point. She had no objection to being told she was pretty, but the young man's tone was so familiar that she felt insulted. Bert should put him out of the house, but Bert had disappeared. Without rising from her chair, she demanded angrily, "What right do you have to come into my room?" Even to her own ears, her accent was as pronounced as her Aunt Ruth's. "No Southern gentleman would think of doing such a thing." Walt did not move. "Well, aren't we high and mighty?" His eyes bold and mocking never left Laura. The sheriff stepped forward. "We have a warrant to search the house, Miss Eastman. These men," he motioned to the group behind him, "are looking for a runaway slave." Laura clutched the sewing in her lap, stabbed her hand on the needle, and as she did so, the sudden pain made her more annoyed than ever. "Then please proceed," she said. She tried to look composed, though her hands were shaking. "My father won't be happy at the way your men are treating the furniture." "They aren't my men," the sheriff said, unhappy. "They've come in from the south, mostly, and the law says I have to cooperate with them. You know I wouldn't come here on my own. Your father is an old friend of mine, and I don't want to lose his goodwill." He stepped aside to turn to the men in the hallway. "Come in and look around, and be quick about it." The men shuffled uneasily and murmured among themselves. Two of them took a few steps into the room and glanced about. Walt was the only one who failed to look embarrassed. He strolled to the wardrobe and took a leisurely survey of Laura's dresses, crisply ironed and scented with lavender. One of the other men said, "Come on, Walt. We don't need to worry about this room. This little Southern lady isn't going to harbor any slave in here." Walt stooped to inspect the floor of the wardrobe and rapped on the wall beside it, as if looking for a hidden room. Laura bent her head over her sewing to hide her anxious eyes. By the time they finally left, she felt limp. The group went across the hall to her parents' room and poked their heads into the sewing room and then clattered down the stairs. The sheriff came back to Laura to apologize again for the intrusion. "I hope you realize I'm just doing my duty. Tell your pa that, will you?" "Yes, I'll tell him." For a moment after the sheriff left, Laura sat without moving. Then she went into the hall where she could hear the men who were gathered downstairs in the entrance. "You think he got away?" one asked. "I figured he wasn't here at all. Maybe Joel never brought him. Or if he did, that little spitfire upstairs wouldn't let him in." "Did you hear her? No Southern gentleman would think of doing such a thing." This remark was followed by laughter. Another voice said grimly, "I'm not so sure. Did you see those clothes hanging behind the stove?" Bert said they were his, but I don't believe it, not for a minute. I say let's keep an eye on the house. The sheriff cut in. "Let's go," he ordered. Laura moaned to herself. How foolish they had been to leave Martin's clothes in plain view. Bert should have known better, and so should she. Feet shuffled in the hall downstairs, and then the door closed. Bert came up the back way. He was grinning. "Nice job, sis." Laura looked up at him, but bit her lip and burst into tears. Bert said awkwardly, "Hey, don't cry now. It's all over." Laura rubbed her eyes on her sleeve. "It was terrible. I was so scared." He looked surprised. "You didn't act scared. You just acted mad." He rolled back the rug. "Let's see how Martin feels." As he lifted the trapdoor, he announced to Martin, "They've gone." Martin was obviously shaken. He took a deep breath and raised himself to the edge of the opening. There he slumped down and glanced around the room as if to assure himself that the men were indeed gone. "I feel like that man in the Bible, Lazarus," he said with a feeble smile. "It's like a tomb in there." Laura couldn't resist smiling. "Where did you hear about Jesus raising Lazarus from? The dead?" "My pappy used to read the Bible to us every day. All the time he read that book." "You'd better be thankful for this tomb," Bert told him. "If you'd stayed in that wardrobe in the spare room, you'd be on your way down south right now." Martin shuddered. I wasn't easy about that wardrobe. I sure do thank you for taking me out of it. And you too, Miss Laura, for letting me stay here." Laura felt that she was receiving credit she didn't deserve. "Bert didn't give me any choice." "You didn't tell on me," Martin pointed out. Again she refused to accept his praise. "I had to think of my father. He'd be in a bad trouble if you were found here. Bert looked at her sharply. Well, whatever your reasons were, I'm glad you kept your mouth shut. We shouldn't have any more trouble now. Joel will come after Martin tonight, and that'll be the end of it. Didn't you hear them? Asked Laura. They saw Martin's clothes in the kitchen, and they said they were going to watch this house. Bert groaned. I knew I should have burned those clothes. They're the only clothes I have. Martin looked shocked. You can keep mine, said Bert. They're too small for me anyway. Thank you. Martin smoothed the front of the blue wool shirt. They're a lot warmer than mine. I need warm clothes up here north. Laura smiled at him. I'll go down and burn those old clothes right now, Martin offered. You'd better stay where you are, Bert went to the windows. If they've got ideas about your clothes, they may come back, thinking they'll catch us by surprise. Martin looked at Laura. I don't want to be in Miss Laura's way. Couldn't I go back to the cellar? Bert left the window. Do you know what they did to those sacks of potatoes? Martin shook his head, wordless. One of those slave hunters took a knife out of his pocket and stabbed it into every bag. Laura felt sick. If Martin had been in one of those potato bags, she would never have forgiven herself for keeping him out of the secret room. Do I have to stay in the hole? Martin asked. No, Bert replied, but you have to be able to get in it in a hurry. We'd better figure that out. What if you were all alone here and you heard the slave catchers at the front door? I'd quick jump in the hole and pull the lid over my head. And how would you get the rug back in place? Asked Bert. Martin thought this over. I'd reach out of the hole and pull that carpet over the top of me. Bert looked doubtful. Let's see you do it. He and Laura watched while Martin lowered himself into the hidden room and pulled the rug over his head. Like a mole, he crawled under it and he had it in place. Then he wormed back under the carpet to the opening and pulled the trapdoor shut. His muffled voice asked, How's that? The rug was wrinkled, but Laura thought Martin had done well under the circumstances. You'd better practice, advised Bert, as Martin came into sight. Keep working at it until you do it fast and get the rug smoother. He started for the door. I'm going down and get rid of your clothes. At the door, he paused. Let's see your shoes. Martin held up his feet, saying apologetically, These shoes have done a lot of walking. Laura could see his feet through the large holes in the bottom of the shoes. That's what I thought, Bert said. He trotted down the hall to his room and he returned shortly, carrying socks and a pair of shoes. See if you can wear these. Martin pulled them on. Pretty good fit, but they look new. You shouldn't give them to me. That's all right, said Bert. My old shoes would be too small for you. I notice you have good-sized feet for the height of you. Once you get started growing, you'll be a tall fellow. Laura had recognized Bert's best shoes, but she said nothing. If her brother was willing to wear his everyday shoes to church, that was his affair. But her heart warmed toward him for his generosity. When Bert left for the kitchen, Laura went down with him. She watched while he stoked the fire in the stove and stuffed in Martin's ragged shirt and trousers. Since they were still damp, they burned slowly. Bert picked up the shoes he had placed on the floor beside the stove and looked despairingly at the smoky fire in the stove. Guess I'll burn these in the fireplace. Soon, the kitchen, heated by 2 fires, was uncomfortably warm. Laura was worried. Bert, it's too late now, but suppose the slave catchers decide to come back for a closer look at those clothes. I'll just say we decided they were too worn out, not worth keeping after all, so we burned them, Bert said, poking a smoldering shoe. Laura opened the back door. The bright autumn day seemed to beckon her. The field behind the vegetable garden was aglow with goldenrod and wild asters. Beyond that, the trees in the wood lot were yellow and crimson. She longed to go outside, but she was afraid of meeting the slave catchers. They might waylay her and ask questions. She especially dreaded meeting the one named Walt. There was something so ruthless about him. She knew he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Martin. Restlessly, she turned back to the kitchen. The clock, ticking loudly on the mantel, caught her eye. 11 o'clock, she said aloud. Will this day never end? Bert added more wood to the stove. If you'd do a little work, the time would go faster. He picked up a brush and went outside, where he began to clean the potatoes he had dug. You don't have to tell me what to do, little brother, said Laura. Her pride was injured at criticism from Bert. It used to be the other way around. She was the one who gave him orders. Somebody ought to boss you, he called, brushing with furious energy. You haven't done a lick of work since you came here. In case you've forgotten, up north we don't have slaves to do everything for us. Laura turned red. She felt like slapping him. She hated to admit that what he said was true. Laura started up the stairs to her room. Then she remembered that it was no longer her refuge, but Martin's. Slowly she returned to the kitchen. She stared at Bert, who was still on the back steps, brushing the potatoes and putting them into a sack. No doubt he'd taken them down to the root cellar to store with the other potatoes and the apples and carrots. Apples, she thought. I'll show him. Snatching up a pan, she hurried to the cellar. She took a dozen apples from a barrel and returned to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was burning well now, and if she was quick about it, she could have fresh apple sauce ready for lunch. Bert grinned wickedly when she called him to lunch. He piled applesauce generously onto one of Mrs. Fitch's biscuits. "What's the idea?" he asked, trying to prove you still know how to cook. Laura didn't answer, and when he went upstairs with 2 plates of food for himself and Martin, she told herself she was glad to be alone. Then she heard a burst of laughter come from upstairs. It made her feel lonely and left out. She closed and barred the back door. Then she, too, filled her plate and climbed up the stairs. Bert and Martin were sitting on the edge of the secret opening with their feet dangling in space. Martin greeted her enthusiastically with, "This is the best applesauce I ever ate." Bert, too, seemed glad to see her. He slapped the floor beside him. "Have a seat." "What were you laughing about?" Laura asked, sitting down in the rocker with self-conscious dignity. "I heard you just before I came up." Bert seemed puzzled and turned questioning eyes to Martin. Martin looked at Bert and then shyly at Laura. "We were talking about you, Miss Laura, sitting on top of the trap door, and those slave catchers saying no little Southern lady would hide me." Bert told me how they said that. Laura was aware that Martin was watching for her reaction, for his big eyes never left her face. She smiled, and he smiled back at her and continued more confidently. "I heard that old chair go creak, creak when you rocked, Miss Laura, and I was ready to burst out laughing there in that little hole." "Weren't you scared I'd tell on you?" Laura asked. Again, Martin seemed to hesitate. He glanced at Laura and then fastened his eyes on the floor. Finally, he said, almost in a whisper, "I was praying you wouldn't." So he had been afraid she'd tell on him. Well, she hadn't earned his trust, she admitted. He trusted Bert. Martin talked to him as freely as he talked to another black boy. But when he spoke to her, he seemed to be afraid of displeasing her. She had noticed the same manner in Uncle Jim's slaves whenever they spoke to white people. She became aware that Martin was staring earnestly at her, so she said gently, "Go ahead. Don't be so afraid to speak up." "I was just going to say," again Martin's gaze traveled to the floor, "nobody who took me in told on me ever since I ran away. Lots of folks hid me, black folks and white ones. They could have sent me back to my master for the big reward, but they didn't." "So lots of people helped you," Laura said thoughtfully. "Yes, ma'am. I couldn't even count how many. Moses," she said, "people who help the poor runaway slaves are the kindest people in the world." "Moses?" Bert laughed. "Moses was a man, and he lived hundreds of years ago." Martin shook his head. "Not the Moses I mean. She's a woman, all right, and she's as black as I am. And she led a whole lot of slaves to the promised land." "Oh," Bert thought, delighted. "I know who you mean. Her name's Harriet Tubman, isn't it? She was a slave herself, and she escaped to Canada. Then she went back down south and helped other slaves to get away. Miss Tubman, that's her name, only everybody calls her Moses. My pappy talked about her, and he told her how his master was going to sell him down south and split up our family. So when Miss Tubman was ready to go north, she came outside our cabin and sang, 'Go down, Moses.' My pappy heard her, and he said, 'There's Moses, it's time for us to go.' Can you sing it?" asked Bert. "Let her hear that song, 'Go Down, Moses.'" Martin appeared glad to oblige. He rocked back and forth and he sang softly, "Oh, go down, Moses, way down into Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." Laura's eyes felt misty. Martin's high, sweet young boy's voice was appealing. Though she had heard Uncle Jim's slaves sing the same song, she had never guessed its hidden meaning. The slaves must think of themselves as Israelites, but Pharaoh, who was he? Their master? "Moses leads the slaves to the promised land?" she asked, wondering. "That's right, Miss Laura. She takes them to Canada. That's the promised land where we can be free." "Why didn't you stay with your family?" Laura asked. "They're in Canada already." "I got sick with measles, and Pappy didn't want to make trouble for the kind Quaker lady we were staying with. She didn't have room to keep hiding so many of us. Moses said I could come on later when I got well, and the Quaker lady took care of me. Miss Tubman, she—" Bert raised his hand for silence. "Listen. Someone's at the front door." All right, guys. That was the end of chapter 8. Talk to you tomorrow.